The range and pasture portfolio from Corteva is continually changing. We've been a company that has kind of stuck into a rut with particular products that we like using over time. And there are better things, let's say, today. And until we get to the point where we're at with curtail, which we can't get anymore, that is what tends to kick us off center to talk about new things. So keep an open mind today. And Abe will present the newest things from Corteva, why they're better, and why we should potentially use these other brands. And Abe, what I'd like to see you do for our geography is probably boil it down to the top 3 to 5 products, maybe 4, that we should focus in on for both range and pasture, fence line spraying, and brush and tree control would be our typical markets.
A little bit of everything. I try to run this very informally when I do update meetings like this. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk with your group, Harlan, and the AFS group at all. Hello, welcome from Kearney, Nebraska. My name is Abe Smith. I'm the range and pasture representative for Nebraska and Iowa. So I cover a pretty broad swath of geography, and just want to be able to talk with you. And as Harlan outlined, just give you an update and really maybe oversimplify some things for you, or what may feel like oversimplified. Harlan asked me also to provide him a handout with kind of 4 different areas highlighted. You had 4 products highlighted. I don't quite have it to 4, Harlan, but it's the same layout, same categories, with some updated graphics for things and a couple newer recommendations for what you received a couple of years ago under Jamie Baumgartner's leadership when you worked with her. So we'll address anything that you have that you want to have for questions. I'm happy to take those questions as we go, or you can save them for the end. This is going to be primarily what Harlan and a couple others may have seen last week, but I do have a couple slides I tucked in there around the clopyralid issue, and we'll probably zip through a couple slides. I wasn't able to get everything edited down the way I wanted to, because I wanted to leave a couple things in if they came up. But more than that, just understand that when you're looking for range and pasture solutions, you should be reaching out to either Kyle, but probably more appropriately me, because I've got a variety of solutions and a lot of wealth of knowledge, over 25 years of knowledge of range and pasture products that I can share with you. And I also understand the need to keep things simple. And so I think we can do that with what you're trying to accomplish with the group. And as well, I know Kyle has probably provided you with some of the guides that we have, and I will provide those as well, because I have my pages kind of pulled out in PDF, and oftentimes we have people either print out the handout that I'll provide you that's specific for what you guys have had previously, but also the other pages that I have with kind of a little bit broader portfolio overview for a variety of things. So with that, I just want to thumbnail out what we'll talk about, and these will be a little bit jumbled around, but I want to talk to you about some of the newer products we have from Corteva. Many of you may have been using Grazon Next, and we have surpassed that with Duracor in a lot of ways here over the last couple of years. This will be the 5th year we've had Duracor. We'll talk about good, better, best recommendations, maybe some timing specific things, reasons why we spray weeds at certain times, what we can expect. I do want to talk with you specifically about CRP and maybe some recommendations for CRP, and touch on leafy spurge. And then we'll touch on brush, but overall, brush tends to be a very species-specific sort of recommendation. I do have one broad general recommendation I'll leave you with that I think is really good. We've received a lot of commendations on. When I give this recommendation out, generally I don't get calls back unless we find out we have a specific weed issue or specific tree issue that we're trying to deal with. But I do like to start out most of my conversations just with this concept, because many of your producers are in the mindset of spraying weeds for weed control. And we don't take a second to step back and really think about, we spray herbicides on every acre of corn and beans, but why do we do that? And the reason is because we're not just trying to control weeds. We're actually in the mindset of increasing our profitability on those acres. And the same thing is true in my range and pasture world. If I can help your customers produce more beef, by producing more grass, that's going to put more dollars in their pocket. So if we get these things lined up correctly, more grass equals more beef equals more money at the end of the day. Generally, this is a concept that can encourage people to consider treating either A, more pastures than what they've been treating, B, choosing some different products that might not be just quite as selective at times, but perhaps maybe even the very selective products with longer residual keeps those weeds out of there for longer and can actually maximize that production over the long haul for them. There's a lot of impacts to poor grass, but just know at the end of the day, especially with poisonous plants, things like poison hemlock or wild parsnip, cows that need vet attention are costly. Vet calls are costly. They're not getting cheaper. The other thing we see is that when we have things like poison hemlock or other poisonous plants, even things like parsnip in those pastures that cause lesions on the skin, that's a drag on the production of that calf to be able to produce. And so whether you're in the feeder cattle or you're grazing cattle just to grow them overall, or if you're in a cow calf production, which the majority of the customers that I run into are, trying to maximize calf production is really critical. What I can tell you after 25 years of range and pasture experience, if we can take a pound of weeds out of that pasture, we're going to put a pound of grass back in at least. And so that helps customers in a variety of ways, but to increase their carrying capacity, we extend their season. You reduce your reliance on purchased feed or purchased hay. You can rotate graze those pastures a little bit easier. And one of the things I do want to highlight since we're coming out of calving season is if you have customers, talk with them about their calving pastures. The calving pastures are the ones that get the most high intensity utilization over 3 or 4 months in the winter. They're used and abused, and a lot of guys will do a good job of giving them a break. But what they may miss the opportunity to do is to make sure they're either fertilizing to improve the productivity and help that area recover, but also do some weed control at the same time. And we found that to be a nice little boost for those areas and really help them recover well. I do want to start with the burning questions that kind of kicked off this process. Indeed, curtail has been discontinued just to a usage decline. It's not a strategic product for us overall. And realistically, I think we can accomplish the same thing. If you want a direct replacement for curtail, your product is going to be wide match at roughly 20 ounces up to 40 ounces. That's going to give you a clopyralid-based product, gives you a very similar feel in terms of what you can do rotationally. Many of the comments I get out of Iowa, especially CRP, and the reasons you may have been using curtail before may be related to, I don't know if this ground is going to come back into production. So curtail gives me a good option to open up that rotational guideline, because we've had aminopyralid molecules in Iowa for a long time, going back to Forefront R&P and Milestone. Those aren't new products for us necessarily, but the reason that curtail has persisted has kind of been specific, and it's specific to Iowa because some of the history we have there. Curtail does an okay job, and it's been conceived or perceived in Iowa as probably the best Canada thistle control out there. And that's not the reality today. So we have a lot of customers that are still coming in asking for curtail, expecting to get that product. You're not going to be able to supply it. So you could go to wide match, or we could replace that with a product like Duracor, which is aminopyralid and Rinskor put together. It's actually better on Canada thistle than any of the clopyralid products has been, but it does have rotational issues. It has manure management issues, but it also excels on other weeds as well, things like poison hemlock, parsnip, which are not desirable in hay, right? If you're going to use CRP for hay. The other thing I like about Duracor, and we'll touch on this a little bit later though, is that when you do have brushy species, Duracor offers a better brushy species combo than what a Graze on Next HL would offer. And so that's a couple of the reasons why I would consider either look at wide match if you want that direct clopyralid replacement from 20 to 40 ounces, or Duracor for that Canada thistle best of breed sort of option for weed control. And especially if you're looking to add some brush control to that, Duracor has been a better option overall. If you have CRP, just make sure you understand the limits of what your local CRP rules are and what your FSA office allows. Oftentimes, there's a lot of limitations on when you can treat. There's nesting windows or egg laying windows that limit that. So midsummer applications often in Iowa can be shut down. Sometimes with these early spring treatment options, a wide match might be okay. I think a Duracore would be a little bit better. It does tend to have a longer half-life as well, and it has a good residual overall. But we need to be asking, especially in Iowa, if they're going to mow that or hay that or burn that potentially. There are haying restrictions with Duracore that would limit its use for hay in Iowa. On Nebraska, we don't have that limitation, but for Iowa as well as Minnesota, there would be limitations to things that might be hayed. That's probably another reason why curtail has persisted for as long as it has, potentially. One of the other questions we get with CRP is seeding. When can we seed with any of these products? We need to do a seeding sometime this year. I always prefer to spray first, wait 45 days usually will get us there with Duracore, but 45 to 60 days may be your limitations depending on the products, and then seed into that. Oftentimes, if we seed early and we come back to spray later, we have to be very cautious and use restricted rates because we have young grass seedlings that need to develop not only a secondary root system, but in that first season of development, they really can't be hit hard with chemistry. And so you may lose some of that seeding potentially. Okay. Again, with forbs, if you're overseeding forbs, you're going to have to wait regardless, probably a year for picoram and or aminopyrrolid. It varies by your forb type, but it's something that they want to consider. And anytime we consider forb safety, forbs do recover with aminopyrrolid as well as picoram. We've shown over time that aminopyrrolid is maybe preferred for forb safety or forb tolerance. Because after a year, they will start to recover. They're not going to be eradicated, though, in one application. Annual applications, we may see a longer effect on that, or we may see more of an eradication effect on that. And we treat actively growing weeds. We want to wait until weeds are growing after a burn or after a mow. We want to do that before a weed hardens off, and we want to use probably 15 to 20 gallons of water at a minimum in a lot of these situations if the grass is high. If the grass has been removed, we don't have a need for as much coverage because we're not trying to get as much covered when grass is 4 to 6 inches tall in that case. We'll touch base on a couple of the newer products. I will mention 3, and I'm going to mention UltraGraze as well, just because it's a concept you may hear from a customer. They may receive something from us promotionally, and I want you to be aware of it, even if you're not going to utilize the system that we have. Duracore is the first product we've had now for about 5 years in the marketplace. It was the first new AI in the range and pasture marketplace in 15 years. It controls more weeds as compared to Graze on Next HL. It has been very easy to use. It's a lower volatility product with no 2,4-D odor that we have with the Graze on Next. And it's used at lower application rates, which can be meaningful if you do have folks looking to impregnate. But more than that, for customers that don't want to have a lot of acres in a jug, we have 1-gallon jugs of Duracore available. A pint per acre will cover about 8 acres. That usually will cover most folks, and I think the package sizing is very favorable for a Duracore. It is what we would call a suspension formulation. It does require a little bit of agitation before use. If it hasn't been 30 days, shake, 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 and you're on your way. But it does tank mix well with others, and it does blend well not only with liquid fertilizer, but it can be used on dry fertilizer. Going back to liquid fertilizer for a second, if you have folks that are going to use UAN and they want to do a weed and feed sort of approach, I actually have less calls back with Duracore for a weed and feed sort of approach versus Graze on Next. Certain fertilizers can cause Graze on Next to get snotty and maybe have some issues because of the amine formulation of 2,4-D that's in there. Some of the key weeds that we control in there, what I do like overall with Duracore is that we do have some brush control already built into that with locust trees. For honey locust, black locust, we do see some good brush activity on those. We have good control on common mullein by the ground. which has been a weed of concern and could actually get us away maybe from chaparral, which can cause certain grass injury at high rates. But it still remains the standard with the aminopyrrolid in there. It's still the standard on musk thistle, Canada thistle, bull, plumless, all the span of thistles, and really good on even spiny amaranth when sprayed, when that spiny amaranth is already emerged. Some of these species is a timing related issue as much as anything. We do a good job of keeping some of it back, but spiny amaranth, much like palmer, as you see on that list below, it's a numbers game. Some of these weeds, when we spray once they're up, we can do a really good job of knocking down. But when you're talking in the case of palmer of 250,000 seeds per plant, even if we do a 99% job of controlling your seedlings before they come up, 1% of $250,000 is still 250 plants that might survive a 99% application. We have been doing very well on those. One of the unique weeds that we do very well on with Duracor specifically is the carrot family. So wild carrot, which also includes, I've already mentioned poison hemlock, but expands into poison hemlock as wild carrot, poison hemlock, and wild parsnip. Parsnip, if you're not aware, is a severe nuisance of a weed which is spread pretty broadly across Iowa. I imagine many of you are familiar with it, but from this product has shown to be significantly better than what we've been doing with Grazon Next, and stops a lot of parsnip right in its track at a pint per acre. Okay. Proclova, I'm not going to mention much here other than to say it's a product that we're working on developing. We hope to have labeling this year. We've been saying that perennially for about the last 4 to 5 years. What's unique about it, it's non-residual, but it is safe to white clover and annual aspidisa. It is not safe to other clovers like red, but having a clover safe sort of option would be unique. And I oftentimes do have people coming to look for non-residual sort of approaches. I know crossbow historically has been a big product up in that northern Iowa, southern Minnesota area. This may not replace the brush activity, but from a non-residual weed control option, this will be something to keep an eye on in the future. Please let me know if you're interested in what that is. Proclova is a combination of 2,4-D as well as our Rinskor that we have in Duracor, very low residual products, about 30 to 40 days to do reseeds or replants with those. Grazon PD3 is our next generation, going all the way back to Grazon P plus D, which is Picoram plus 2,4-D or Tordon. For folks that have leafy spurge, this may be a product to consider where you have restricted use licenses available, where you're looking maybe for some heavy duty brush control options, including oaks, maples, ash. This may be a product to consider. But what's differentiated with Grazon PD3 is that it's a lower use rate chemistry. It's more concentrated, and it utilizes our 2,4-D choline that we have in our Enlist system. So it is truly non-volatile. It has very low odor to it. People that have been using it have been very, very pleased with what they've been able to do with that product overall. And I do have rate charts available, conversion charts. If you have people that are familiar with the old P plus D product, we can convert that pretty easily overall. What do we treat when we're talking about spring application? What are our target weeds that we want to work with? In spring, we're going to work on summer annuals or winter annuals even. So henbit, vetch, cocklebur, sunflower. Biennial weeds, the thistle complex that you know, as well as things like curly cup gumweed or goldenrod, maybe even sweet clovers on that list, and then perennials as well. Ironweed, Canada thistle, maybe absinthe wormwood is on that list for you. That timing is generally going to be in this spring window, generally May, June. There's some exceptions to that, maybe earlier, maybe not later per se, unless as far up north as some of you guys are, you may have a late run. Depends on when we get our heat and when we get our moisture. But from a broad brush standpoint, if you want a home run basic recommendation, Duracor at 16 ounces is what I've been standing by pretty consistently. And then Grazon Next at 28 ounces as well. Both of those, I do recommend using an NIS. I recommend NIS with almost everything that I spray, with the exception of maybe larger weeds or maybe some brush, where an MSO at 1% may make good sense. So if you're going through a rescue treatment, you're looking at late season large weeds, MSOs may be useful to help cut that cuticle open. We do think about buckbrush a little bit differently. So buckbrush is Western snowberry. It's a plant that you may run into, but it is some of the brush that we do see on the western side of Iowa. This is a spring only plant. We want to treat it usually before June 15th, because the exterior of it gets waxy, can't be penetrated very well. At the latest July 4th. And we changed that recommendation up to 16 ounces of Duracor with a pound of 2,4-D, or we could look at the 32 ounces of Grazon Next and a half ounce of MSM or metsulfuron, product you would know as Ally as well. And it comes in a variety of other brand names as well. If you need some help, I can help you figure out what that is exactly. But the half ounce of metsulfuron could potentially cause some grass injury, especially on fescue grass. So that would be one thing to keep in mind. Generally, the areas of buckbrush and fescue don't necessarily correlate, but they can.
Abe, we have a question.
Yes.
In the chat. Is Pasture Guard still the best option for trees and fence lines like mulberry trees?
I think Pasture Guard remains a very good option for folks that are spraying tree lines because of its non-residual nature. It has very low, if any, soil residual. So I appreciate that question. And I would say yes. The other option might be looking at just straight remedy, and potentially down the road, like a Proclova with, probably I would say the Pasture Guard is the best option here for the near future. And the rates of that, a pint to a pint and a half. Usually guys are, since they're fence line spraying, they're putting that in a sprayer tank. I do have a chart that I put together for folks to be able to tank mix from relatively easily. At least it gives them a starting point for that. And that'll be in one of the handouts that is provided there. But usually it kind of boils down to whatever use rate we're trying to target per 25 gallons is a good starting point. Okay.
Follow up to that. Describe what the new Rinskor product ingredient is.
So the new Rinskor product is a growth regulator, AI. It is a unique class of growth regulator. So it's not just an oxenic growth regulator. It has a specific use site. You may be familiar with one of the cousin products of this, which is also a unique AI of Elevore. That AI was called Arlex. So they're kind of kissing cousins. They're unique sites of activity that they disrupt in the plants. Rinskor itself is not sold in any other products outside in your marketplace. It is sold in the rice marketplace for some broadleaf control on its own. It replaces a lot what the 2,4-D does, and it does some things better around wild carrot and maybe some other species to that as well. Okay.
Thank you.
Keep them coming in, guys. I'd much prefer a conversation at times. So at least we know we're hitting on some things you guys are interested in. Okay. With fall applications, we're not going to target annuals at all. We're going to be targeting biennials, things like musk thistle, bull thistle, common mullein, and your perennials, which predominantly in your area is going to be Canada thistle. I recommend starting that after your first light frost. That could be mid-September. It could go all the way till when the ground freezes hard. That usually down in my country down here in south central Nebraska is going to be in that mid-November sort of window. Similar rates. In the fall, we tend to see guys use the higher end of the rate range, the 20 ounce of Duracor or the 34 ounce of Graze, 32 ounce of Grazon Next. Those two price points should be very comparable at this point in time. There really shouldn't be that much spread or differentiation between the two of them at this point. Talk about brush, coming back to your spray and fence lines. There are some other options for spray and brush, and most folks are going to look at the left side of the chart here, the foliar. That's what most people spraying fence lines are going to do. Foliar applications take place when the plant is trying to actively green up, grow up. We got to have leaves on it though. Foliar applications brush can't be done in April because there's no leaves on anything. Generally speaking, these are going to be done at the earliest late May, more predominantly in July. June and August would be kind of on the other side of that, maybe not as preferred, but can be successful with that. I do have a lot of success with basal bark applications using Remedy as well as it's a combination of Remedy and diesel. Maybe not a good broadcast application, obviously not. We're targeting almost surgical, being able to surgically go in and remove trees or go in and chemically girdle trees and remove them over about a year's time. And we like to do this because it can be done at odd times of year. It can be done as long as there's no standing snow. And I tell folks to buy your cheap pump up sprayer from Baumgars or Farm and Fleet. Use them for about a season, maybe 2 seasons, and throw them out, because the diesel will chew up a lot of, if you try and put this in a UTV or ATV sprayer, it'll usually chew up your seals and your pumps pretty quick because they're not rated for diesel fuel. So go with a cheap pump up sprayer, go treat the bottom 12, 15, maybe even 18 inches of tree, 360 degrees around. Effective to up to 6 inches, maybe a little bit more, depends on how much juice you get on them. And that Remedy in this situation acts like I compare it to a transdermal nicotine patch. It releases that trichopyr over a longer period of time, more so than if you were to spray it with something else that would be a salt-based or an amine-based chemistry. Works very well. You can use that basal bark treatment for cut stumps, but it's also very common to use Tordon RTU still for cut stumps. And it's always good to have a supply of that laying around ready to go. Paint that onto the stem that you're trying to get rid of. Any exposed roots that you want to, any exposed roots need to be treated as well on those. For brush, your timing's dependent on your species. There are certain plants that I don't have a lot of good solutions on. I get a lot of questions on Eastern Red Cedar. We may still get one yet today from you guys. I haven't heard one yet, but straight Tordon tends to be the most common recommendation, although we do have some people that might use a specialty chemistry like a surmount or high rates of Tordon, just trying to get control of some of those. The downside is the high rates of a lot of these chemistries can cause grass damage, which doesn't necessarily help the situation long term. I do want to say for multiflora rows, and one of the things that will be on your recommendation for mixed brush areas is going to be this Duracor with Remedy. I have had lots of good response from the Pina Duracor, Pina Remedy group on things like rows. Even on areas with buckbrush, folks that have treated that have done very well. But oftentimes your customer is going to come in and say, I just have brush. I don't know what it is. And this is where we're going to start. We're going to start with Duracor and Remedy at a pint each. And I think we can do a pretty decent job for them in that case. Okay. And you can see the others that are listed down there.
Sorry, we had another question come in. When treating stumps of very large size, 2 feet, 3 feet in diameter, how much do we treat with Tordon RTU or Remedy diesel? How much do you treat?
You just want to coat them well. You want to give them a good soak, and when you get to trees that large, because of the extensive root system, you may have to retreat, and oftentimes, depending on the species of tree, you may have to go back and look for new shoots starting to come up. These may not be a one and done sort of approach. This may be an area, especially where you have these large trees, where I would probably go back the following year with a pasture guard would be a good selection in this case. That would be, it would take out most trees, it would leave your grass. And so that's probably the direction I would go in that situation. Okay. I will touch on leafy spurge briefly. There is some in northwest Iowa that I'm aware of. We have had some plots out at Duracor 20 ounces with some Tordon. If people don't want to look at the Grazon PD3, Tordon at a pint can look pretty good. Let's touch on, though, can we spray these products around trees? With Tordon, I want you to be extremely careful with Tordon. Duracor has a better record in and around trees, with the exceptions for leguminous trees, things like locust, redbuds, carragana. Aminopyrrolid can be very hard on those. But if we stay out of the drip line of those trees, usually we don't see adverse impacts with either of those products. And again, for surfactants or adjuvants, a quart per 100 of NIS will do very good job for most folks. It probably is the number one thing that many of these small landowners could use, is to have you send them home with a good gallon or a good jug of your quality non-ionic surfactant and make them use it. Many applications could be improved just by adding 4 to 8 ounces of NIS into some of these tanks. It would really be a help overall. We do have some grazing restrictions with our aminopyrrolid products. With Duracor and Graze On Next, we do have restrictions that talk about no lactating dairy animals until either 7 days after application, or in certain cases with Graze On Next, HL and Remedy, no lactating dairy animals until the following season. So what that translates to specifically is it is talking about dairy animals. So these are animals that are being utilized in active dairy production. If they're beef cattle, we shouldn't be concerned about it. You can rest easy on that. Only for lactating dairy animals are these restrictions common to. And then haying restrictions in Iowa, we do not allow the hay to go off farm for areas that are sprayed with aminopyrrolid. And they do have to be cognizant of moving any cattle that have treated hay in their system, in their manure, off to another farm, or probably more likely into crop ground. What we do have in our label is for 3 days to be in a corral or some holding area with non-treated forage, and that usually helps get them cleaned out. 1 day is really critical, 2 days is better, 3 days is best in those situations. So the copyrrolid products with the restrictions on those, Duracor, Graze On Next, and Chaparral. I haven't mentioned Chaparral to date yet. It has kind of fallen out of vogue for 2 reasons. Number one, you can resource metsulfuron for a very economical price anymore. And our Chaparral price per acre, the bang for the buck that we're giving you, I think you get a better bang for your buck with Duracor than you can with Chaparral. You can take Duracor and add some metsulfuron for a pretty close price anymore. Our picoram-based products, Graze On PD3, Graze On P plus D, as well as Tordon, are the picoram-based compounds, as well as Tordon RTU. It's a little bit different product. It is non-restricted because it is such a diluted form of picoram overall. Okay. Let's see. We've covered some of the supplemental labels for movement of hay. South Dakota and Nebraska folks do have the provisions for movement of hay on those. Okay. We did talk about CRP at the start, and just for folks that are doing CRP brush treatments, just a couple things to be in mind of. If you're going to mow or hay, delay your application until you see your foliage resprouting. If you go through there and mow and you go immediately spray, you're not going to do very good on your brush because you don't have anything to move herbicide into. We want to use 20 gallon an acre to make sure we get good coverage. I find results of July and August are probably the best. The more leaves we have, the better results we have. Hot and nasty is a tough time to spray. You may need to be cognizant of some of your temps and volatility. Remedy is an ester-based product. It can be volatile in some situations, especially when we're talking about 90+ degree heat. So be aware of that. We tend to see a lot of Remedy used in CRP nonetheless because it has a lower impact on forbs, far more or less than what you would with a Surmount type product. So Remedy Ultra and Pasture Guard for most hardwoods, which would include locust, willows, sumac, your poison ivies, your poison oaks, blackberries. Duracor for honey locust, black locust. And then for the heavy duty, we need ash and elms and maples and oaks, and we're probably going to end up talking about Surmount in those cases. Okay. So trying to get this very simple and generally kind of following Harlan's direction to kind of dumb this down a little bit. I think primarily you need Duracor at a pint to 20 ounces, whether it's spring or fall. Your use rate's going to depend on how much Canada thistle you have. If you just have general weed control, we're going to stick with the pint. If you have a bunch of Canada thistle, we're going to look at that 20 ounce rate. Okay. Same thing for parsnip. Those can be treated fall or spring, leafy spurge as well. Pasture guard along fence lines makes a lot of sense, but again, those aren't not necessarily broadcast sprayed. Those are usually ATV, UTV sprayed and spot treated. So,
Abe,
yeah.
When customers are spraying fence lines, they are most commonly going after giant ragweed and brush. What is the best product to recommend?
So for pasture guard is a good place to start. And if they are in a situation where you're adjacent to crop ground or you don't want any high residual products used, just stick with pasture guard. It will be sufficient for what they're trying to do, generally at the rates they're looking at as well. If they can stand, or if they're adjacent to other pasture, or they're in areas, even along some roadsides, things like that, Duracor for additional broadleaf control and additional broadleaf residual has been really good, and it's also going to help with your brush. So that would be my direction. So if you're going to have a pint and a half of pasture guard in 25 gallons, I'd probably put a pint of Duracor in there as well. What other questions do you have, guys?
Anything else from the team?
I do want to detail out maybe a couple things that I will try and show you here if I can get them pulled up. I do have this sheet that is based off of the previous edition that we worked with you guys on. Similar in terms of layout, talking about your pasture guard recommendations, your Duracor remedy recommendations, then just for general pasture improvement and for cut surface on trees. That would be one thing that's out there that I will provide. Will get emailed out and you guys can either print off in the office and have available. But also behind this QR code here, you will find a lot of other resources, some of which have been highlighted in my presentation today. Let's see, I want to reduce that here for a second.
Yeah, you get it up on the screen. We'll take a picture of it here. There we go. I got it. Michelle, why don't you grab that too? Oh, yeah.
I got it.
Okay. Yep. So for the AFS team on board here, Michelle will be distributing all these documents for your reference and for your recommendation. Like Abe said earlier in the presentation, it's been my goal to him to make this easy for you, have a few very reliable, durable go-to products so you can remember them and not question really how successful will we be with our application. We're going to be successful focusing on these brands.
Yeah. So one of the key things that are in the Corteva book that Kyle's provided you guys, but I utilize every day as well, is this sheet here. Just gives you a broad brush of a lot of products, a lot of information packed in here. It details out some of the basal bark treatments that we talked about. But I talked about the spray guide or the tank mix guide. I utilize this with customers at least once a week, and I get a lot of questions around this. So how much goes in the tank? How much goes in the tank? This gives you anywhere from 1 gallon to 100 gallon ballpark of what sort of recommendations could we make. So I find this to be very end user helpful to them, because you guys get peppered with a ton of questions, I know, all the time, and it's not central to your business. It's not necessarily central to how you want to work, and that's fine. That's why we have specialists like myself to be able to serve this business, and look forward to helping you guys in the future as things come up. And if you want to put out plots with some of these products, sure willing to help support that, and just make sure that you guys are continuing to be trained on some of the better products we have out there. All right.
Abe, I got a question for you. You could maybe help add validity to an old wives' tale or dispel a myth that if we've missed spraying our Canada thistle earlier in the season and they've gone from purple bloom into kind of setting a seed head, that by spraying them at that time of year, we're going to render the seeds stagnant or
Okay.
sterile. Is that true or not true?
So that old wives' tale is rooted back to a study done in 1996 or 98 out at Colorado State University, and it's specific to the AI metsulfuron. And it's really the only product I know that's been studied like this. But they did find some utility of it. But I would say the bigger picture is this, Harlan, for anyone that wants to do this, think about, have you ever sprayed a corn plant at the wrong time or maybe with the wrong chemistry? You ever spray a corn plant at tassel and you get some chemistry onto that tassel or onto the silks of that plant, and you look at that corn cob later in the season, you pull samples out of there, and you'll notice that every one of those cobs has damage on it. They're not producing at the highest level they should be because they've been damaged. The same thing is true for many of these thistles. Whether you apply these herbicides, and I would say bolt is when I want to see most of these applications made. Good. Is while those seed heads are still forming, that's when you have the chance to make those changes. Now, if you go out there and we do a desiccation application of a glyphosate for whatever reason late in the season, are those corn plants messed up? Well, let's say they weren't Roundup ready for whatever reason. Somehow, some way we made that happen. The reality is the herbicide has very little impact once those kernels are set. Okay, so you could pull those cobs off, you could plant those seeds, and you find really good viability. I'd much rather damage those seeds earlier rather than later if you're looking to sterilize or reduce the seed impact on that.
Any other questions from the group? Thanks for that advice. There's things that we think we've learned over the years just from experience, and some, have grounded themselves into being the truth, whether they're true or not.
Yeah.
All right, team, we've taken 45 minutes. I'll give you 5 seconds to shout out another question. There's nothing in the chat box, so we're good there.
You got a very quiet group, but I appreciate the questions that came in through the chat, and I hope you guys have a great start of the season. Hope things get off going well. And when it comes to pastures, when you do have questions, please keep my number. Utilize the resources that we have. Reach out. Harlan can put you in contact with me, or Kyle can put you in contact with me. I'm more than happy to visit with you as those needs come up.
Thank you for presenting, and thank you everybody for joining today.
All right. Take care.
Goodbye.